Some people walk into a room and the air changes. Not because they are the loudest or the most confident looking. Not because they have a title or a reputation, but because something in the way they speak, the way they hold attention, the way they choose their words, and the way they pause between them tells every person in that room that this person understands something most people do not. They understand that communication is not about talking. It is about what happens inside the other person while you are talking. And that understanding, that specific knowledge of how the human mind receives, filters, and responds to language is what separates speakers who change things from speakers who simply fill the air. This audiobook is about that knowledge. It is about the psychology underneath every powerful conversation. You will learn what the brain actually does when it hears a message, why logic alone almost never persuades anyone of anything, how trust forms and dissolves in seconds, and what the most effective communicators in the world do differently when they open their mouths. None of this requires a natural gift for words. It requires understanding people, and that understanding, chapter by chapter, is exactly what this book will build. If you are enjoying this audiobook and want to continue building real communication confidence, subscribe to this channel now. More chapters are coming, and each one will guide you step by step through mastering every conversation. Chapter 1. The hidden layer beneath every conversation. Every conversation happens on two levels at the same time. Most people only know about one of them. The first level is the surface level, the literal exchange of words, the information being shared, the questions being asked and answered. This is the level most people prepare for when they prepare to communicate. They think about what to say, what points to make, what information to present, and all of that preparation has real value. But the second level, the one happening simultaneously and largely invisibly, is the psychological level. It is the emotional and relational undercurrent running beneath the words, shaping how everything being said is received, filtered, interpreted, and ultimately acted upon. Communicators who only operate on the first level are regularly confused by why their perfectly logical messages fail to land the way they expected. The psychological layer of conversation includes several streams running simultaneously. There is the question of whether the listener feels safe in the interaction, whether they sense threat or openness in the emotional atmosphere. There is the question of whether the listener trusts the speaker, not just intellectually, but at the gut level, where most trust decisions are actually made. There is the question of whether what is being said connects to what the listener actually cares about, or whether it is asking them to care about something they have no current investment in. And there is the constant background evaluation the listener's making about the speaker as a person, not just as a source of information, because the human brain processes communication relationally before it processes it rationally. Research in social neuroscience has given communicators a clearer picture of what actually happens in the brain during conversation than any previous generation of human beings has had access to. When two people talk, their brain activity begins to synchronize in ways that correlate directly with how well communication is working. The listener's brain activity starts to mirror the speaker's in the regions associated with meaning-making and emotional processing. When this synchronization is strong, understanding is deep, and trust builds naturally. When it breaks down, often because of emotional disconnection or perceived inauthenticity, comprehension drops and skepticism rises. The quality of the relationship between speaker and listener is not just a context for communication. At the neurological level, it is the communication. Understanding the hidden layer explains something that baffles many technically skilled people. A person can deliver an argument that is logically airtight, factually perfect, and organized brilliantly, and still persuade no one. Another person can make a simpler argument, in less formal language, with fewer data points, and move a room to action. The difference is almost never in the content. It is in the psychological conditions that have been created around the content. The second speaker created conditions in which the audience was ready to receive. The first speaker delivered information into conditions that made the audience resistant. Working on what you say without working on the conditions in which you say it is like placing furniture in a house before you have checked whether the foundation is solid. The concept of psychological safety, developed extensively in organizational research by Amy Edmondson, provides a useful lens for understanding why some conversations produce genuine exchange and others produce performance. In contexts where people feel psychologically safe, meaning they believe that offering a genuine response will not cost them relationally or professionally, they communicate honestly and contribute their actual thinking. In contexts where they do not feel safe, they manage their response rather than offer it. The managed response is the version edited for self-protection rather than for accuracy or usefulness. Every skilled communicator, whether they know the term or not, is working to create psychological safety as a prerequisite for genuine exchange. The emotional climate of a conversation is set, largely, by the speaker. Not entirely and not forever, but the person who initiates communication has significant influence over the emotional starting point, from which the listener receives everything that follows. Research on emotional contagion, the process by which one person's emotional state is transmitted to and taken on by those around them, shows that this transmission is rapid, largely unconscious, and bidirectional. The speaker who begins a conversation carrying anxiety or defensiveness seeds those states in the listener. The speaker who begins with genuine warmth and calm creates a very different reception environment. This is not about performing an emotion. It is about understanding that your internal state is a communication channel that is always broadcasting. One of the most practically useful shifts a communicator can make is to change the central question they bring to any important conversation. Instead of asking, "What do I want to say?" the more productive question is, "What does this person need to feel?" in order to be genuinely open to what I want to share. This question reorients attention from self to other, from message to receiver, from transmission to reception. It is the question that excellent therapists, great teachers, effective negotiators, and inspiring leaders are all asking, often without articulating it explicitly. And it is the question that, once asked habitually, transforms the quality of every subsequent exchange because it builds communication from the listener's psychological reality outward rather than from the speaker's content inward. This first chapter is the foundation for everything that follows, because the entire book is built on one central insight. Communication is not what you say. It is what happens inside the other person when you say it. That shift in definition changes everything that comes after. It changes how you prepare, what you pay attention to during the conversation, how you measure success, and where you look when something is not working. Every skill, technique, and psychological principle in the chapters ahead flows from this root understanding. The quality of your communication is ultimately the quality of the experience you create in the minds and hearts of the people you speak to. Chapter 2. First Impressions and the Brain That Cannot Be Argued With. Psychologist Nalini Ambady ran a study that made many people uncomfortable when the results came in. She showed participants brief silent video clips of teachers they had never seen before, ranging from 2 seconds to 30 seconds in length. She then asked those participants to rate the teachers on qualities like warmth, competence, and effectiveness. When she compared these ratings to the ratings the teachers received from students who had spent an entire semester in their classes, the correlation was striking. People who watched 2 seconds of silent video with no information about credentials, no knowledge of teaching style, no exposure to actual teaching, formed impressions that significantly predicted how full semester students evaluated the same teachers. 2 seconds, silent, no words at all, and the impression predicted something real. The human brain makes initial social judgments at a speed that makes deliberate, rational evaluation impossible as a first response. Research using brain imaging has shown that the amygdala, the brain's threat and relevance processor, begins forming a response to a new face within 33 milliseconds of seeing it. That is faster than conscious awareness can form. The evaluation that happens in that window is not rational. It is pattern matching against stored templates built from a lifetime of social experience. Templates organized around the fundamental social questions that have mattered throughout human evolutionary history. Is this person safe or dangerous? Are they a friend or a threat? Are they high status or low? These questions are answered by the brain before the conscious mind has had any chance to intervene. The primacy effect ensures that these rapid first impressions carry disproportionate weight in everything that follows. Research in cognitive psychology established long ago that information received first creates an interpretive frame through which all subsequent information is filtered. The person who makes a strong positive first impression has created conditions in which their subsequent words are received charitably. Ambiguities are resolved in their favor. Weaknesses are minimized. The person who makes a poor first impression faces the opposite conditions. Ambiguities are resolved against them. Strengths are minimized. And the audience is looking for evidence that confirms the initial negative assessment rather than evidence that challenges it. The game is genuinely not fair, which is why understanding what produces first impressions is among the most practically important things a communicator can learn. Physical presence is the primary carrier of first impression information because the body is visible before the words begin. The posture a person carries as they enter a room, the quality and pace of their movement, the expression that rests naturally on their face when they think no one is forming opinions. All of this is being processed and assessed before a word has been spoken. Research on what specific physical characteristics produce perceptions of confidence and competence identified a cluster of behaviors that reliably shift impression formation, an upright but relaxed spine, movement that is purposeful rather than either hurried or tentative, a facial expression that is open and engaged rather than tight or blank, and genuine eye contact made before and during the initial exchange. None of these require exceptional physical appearance or unusual natural confidence. All of them are controllable. The handshake, in cultures where it is a standard greeting, carries a remarkable amount of social information in a very brief physical exchange. Research on handshake and impression formation found that a firm, complete, dry, appropriately timed handshake correlated significantly with positive evaluations of the greeter across dimensions, including extroversion, openness, and emotional stability. This finding was replicated across studies and held across gender. The handshake functions as a microcosm of the entire relationship being initiated. Its confidence, its attentiveness to the other person, its appropriate strength, signal things about the person that the rational mind then uses to fill in a much larger impression than the handshake itself warranted. This is how first impression formation works in general. Small signals get used as evidence for large conclusions. Vocal qualities are the physical communication element that operates most powerfully in the first impression window, while being the least consciously monitored by most communicators. Research on voice and social perception has established that judgments about a speaker's competence, trustworthiness, and social status are formed from vocal qualities alone within seconds and with a consistency that is difficult to override with subsequent information. Specifically, voices that are lower in pitch, produced from a relaxed and open throat rather than a tight or high one, and that carry genuine resonance from the chest and body rather than a thin constrained sound, are consistently rated higher on competence and trustworthiness dimensions than higher pitched, thin, or strained voices. These vocal qualities are trainable and are not fixed characteristics of a person's voice. Clothing and physical presentation signal social information through the same basic mechanism as all other first impression cues. They activate stored social templates and allow rapid categorization in ways that influence subsequent evaluation. Research on attire and impression formation consistently shows that people dressed in ways that match or slightly exceed the formality norms of a given context are evaluated more favorably on competence dimensions than those dressed below the norm. More interesting is the finding on what researchers call enclothed cognition, the effect that clothing has on the wearer's own psychological state. People wearing clothing associated with a particular role, an expert's coat, a powerful executive's suit, performed measurably better on tasks associated with that role, even when their ability was equivalent to that of people wearing neutral clothing. What you wear changes not just how others see you, but how you think. The most important practical insight from the research on first impressions is not that you need to perform a particular presentation, but that you need to manage the gap between your intention and your impact. Most people believe they are making a certain impression when they are making a quite different one, because the signals that produce first impressions are largely produced outside conscious awareness. The person who walks into a room believing they appear confident while tension in their jaw and shoulders is communicating something closer to defensive, is not in control of the impression being formed. Developing accurate self-awareness about the first impression you actually make through video feedback, through honest input from trusted others, and through deliberate attention to physical habits, is the prerequisite for intentionally shaping it. Chapter 3. The Neuroscience of Trust, What the Brain Needs Before It Opens. Trust is the most load-bearing structure in any communication relationship. Every subsequent exchange, every piece of information shared, every request made or complied with, is supported by the trust that exists between the people communicating. When trust is high, communication becomes exponentially easier. Less needs to be explained. More is taken in good faith. Ambiguities are resolved charitably, and requests are met with generosity. When trust is low, even accurate and well-intentioned messages face resistance, skepticism, and the defensive scrutiny of a mind protecting itself from something it suspects is not entirely what it appears to be. Understanding what actually builds and destroys trust at the neurological level gives the communicator a kind of architectural knowledge that changes every interaction. Neuroscientist Paul Zak spent years studying the brain chemistry of trust and identified oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, as a critical mediator of trust formation between people. His research found that experiences of being treated with genuine care, of being seen as an individual rather than as a type, of receiving something unexpected and personal from another person, triggered oxytocin release in ways that measurably increased trust and cooperation with the source of that experience. The implications are specific. Behaviors that signal genuine attention to the other person as an individual, remembering personal details, using their name naturally, acknowledging something real about their specific situation, are not just courtesy behaviors. They are neurochemical interventions that change the biochemical environment in which everything else is received. The two-factor model of trust that has become most widely used in trust research distinguishes between cognitive trust, which is based on assessments of competence, reliability, and track record, and affective trust, which is based on the felt sense that the other person genuinely cares about your well-being. Both are necessary for complete trust, but they build through different mechanisms and are damaged in different ways. Cognitive trust is built through consistent performance and destroyed by inconsistency or demonstrated incompetence. Affective trust is built through warmth, attentiveness, and genuine interest in the other person, and is destroyed by evidence of self-interest that overrides concern for the other's well-being. The skilled communicator attends to both dimensions rather than assuming that expertise and track record are sufficient in the absence of genuine warmth. The sequencing of warmth and competence in trust formation matters in a way that most professionals have backward. Research by Amy Cuddy and her colleagues demonstrated through extensive experimentation that warmth evaluations precede and gate competence evaluations in the formation of social impressions. When warmth is established first, subsequent demonstrations of competence are received as valuable and reassuring. When a person leads with competence in the absence of established warmth, their demonstrated ability can actually increase the threat the listener feels, rather than increasing trust, because a highly competent person who does not seem to care about you is a more formidable adversary than a less competent one. This is why the doctor who establishes genuine human connection before demonstrating medical authority is more trusted than the equally skilled doctor who leads with credentials and expertise. Vulnerability calibrated to context is among the most rapid trust accelerators available to a communicator, precisely because it is so rarely used in contexts where performance is expected. When a speaker acknowledges genuine uncertainty about something, admits a relevant limitation, or shares a real challenge they have faced, rather than only presenting the polished version of their experience, they signal several things simultaneously that shift the trust landscape dramatically. They signal that they are honest enough not to require a perfect facade. They signal that they are secure enough not to feel threatened by the exposure of genuine limitation. And they signal that they respect the relationship enough to bring something real to it rather than a managed performance. The admission of not knowing, offered genuinely and in the right moment, produces more trust than the authoritative claim to know everything. Consistency across contexts is the trust dimension that extends beyond any individual conversation into the long arc of relationship and reputation. Research on organizational trust identified what researchers call behavioral integrity, the alignment between what a person says and what they do, as one of the strongest long-term predictors of how trusted they are by colleagues and direct reports. The promises made in the heat of a persuasive moment that are not kept, the commitments made to one audience that are contradicted in front of another, the values espoused publicly that are not practiced privately, all of these erode the kind of trust that single conversations cannot build because they are revealing something about character that no amount of skilled communication can hide indefinitely. Physical mirroring, the subtle and largely unconscious matching of another person's posture, movement pace, vocal rhythm, and even breathing patterns, is a powerful trust-building mechanism that operates below the threshold of deliberate awareness for both parties. Research on mimicry and social bonding found that people who were subtly mirrored by a conversation partner rated the interaction as more positive, rated the conversation partner as more likable and trustworthy, and were more willing to cooperate with requests from that person, all without being able to articulate why. The mechanism appears to involve the same neurological systems underlying the experience of being understood, the experience of being with someone who is genuinely in sync with you rather than simply in proximity. This natural synchronization can be gently and consciously encouraged through genuine attention to the other person, rather than through mechanical imitation. Trust, once built, creates a relational context that makes every subsequent communication more effective than it would be in the absence of trust. The trusted communicator can deliver difficult messages that an equally accurate but less trusted source cannot deliver without triggering resistance. They can make requests that a stranger would be refused on. They can acknowledge mistakes without losing credibility because the overall trust account is full enough to absorb the withdrawal. This compounding quality of trust, the way it makes all future communication progressively more effective, is the reason that investing in trust building as a communication priority always returns more than it costs, even when the investment requires the vulnerability and patience that building real trust demands. Chapter 4. How Persuasion Really Works, Beyond Logic. There is a story every undergraduate philosophy student learns about how humans make decisions. According to this story, People encounter a proposition, evaluate the evidence for and against it, and then reach a conclusion based on which side is stronger. This story is appealing because it makes humans look rational. It is also, according to decades of decision-making research, largely fictional, as a description of how most humans actually make most decisions. People decide first. Then they find reasons. The decision is made by the emotional and intuitive systems of the brain with impressive speed and certainty. The reasons come afterward, generated by the rational mind to justify what the deeper systems have already determined. Understanding this sequence is not cynical. It is the most useful thing a communicator trying to persuade anyone of anything can know. Jonathan Haidt's Moral Foundations research introduced a metaphor that captures the relationship between emotion and reason in decision-making more accurately than any dry neuroscience explanation. He described the emotional mind as an elephant and the rational mind as the rider sitting on top. The rider has a limited ability to guide the elephant through clear cues in calm conditions. But when the elephant wants to go somewhere, the rider does not stop it. The rider rationalizes the direction after the fact. The implications for persuasion are direct. Arguments that address only the rider, no matter how logical and well-structured, will not move the elephant. The communicator who wants to change minds must first address the elephant, the values, the emotions, the identity considerations, the social norms, the gut-level resonance that determines where the elephant is already inclined to go. The role of identity in persuasion is one of the most consistently underestimated by communicators who approach persuasion as primarily an information problem. Research on identity protective cognition found that people do not evaluate evidence neutrally when the evidence has implications for their identity. They evaluate it through a filter that asks whether accepting this would require them to see themselves differently, to acknowledge that their group was wrong, to change a view that is tied to who they are rather than just what they believe. When the answer is yes, the resistance to the evidence is not about the evidence at all. It is about self-protection. The skilled persuader finds a way to make the desired conclusion compatible with, or ideally supportive of, the listener's identity, rather than threatening to it. Social proof is the persuasion mechanism that most reliably operates outside conscious awareness, and that most people encounter daily without recognizing it as persuasion at all. Research by Robert Cialdini established that people use the behavior of similar others as a primary source of information about what is correct, appropriate, and safe to do in a given situation. This is not irrational. In genuinely uncertain situations, looking at what others are doing is often the most efficient way to identify the right course of action. But the brain applies this heuristic in situations that are not genuinely uncertain as well, producing compliance with social norms, even when independent evaluation would lead to a different conclusion. The communicator who can honestly frame a desired behavior or conclusion as what most people in the listener's relevant reference group already believe or do is using social proof in a way that is simultaneously psychologically powerful and, when accurate, entirely ethical. Narrative is the persuasion format that the human brain is most deeply wired to receive and respond to. Before writing, before formal argument structures, before evidence-based reasoning, human knowledge and values were transmitted through story. The brain retains its ancient architecture for processing narrative, and the research on narrative transportation, the psychological state of being genuinely absorbed in a story, shows that people in a state of narrative transportation reduce their critical evaluation of the story's claims and increase their alignment with its values and conclusions. A well-told story that illustrates a point persuades more reliably than the best logical argument for the same point because it reaches the emotional and intuitive systems that arguments cannot access. The communicator who can find the true story that makes their point real and human and felt has found the most direct route to genuine persuasion. The anchoring effect is a persuasion principle so reliably operative that it works even when people are explicitly warned about it. Research on anchoring by Kahneman, Tversky, and subsequently dozens of other researchers found that the first number or position offered in a negotiation or evaluation creates a reference point that disproportionately influences where the final outcome lands, even when both parties know that the anchor was arbitrary. In communication terms, this means that whoever establishes the initial frame for a conversation, whoever sets the terms of discussion, whoever offers the first proposal or position, has a structural advantage in shaping where the conversation ends. The communicator who understands anchoring begins important conversations by setting the frame deliberately, rather than waiting to see what frame the other party will establish. Emotional resonance is the dimension of persuasion that cannot be engineered through technique alone, and that the most effective communicators develop through genuine engagement with what other people care about. The message that moves people is the message that accurately touches something the listener holds as genuinely important. A value that is central to their identity, a fear that is real and current, a hope that they have not spoken out loud, but that matters to them. Research on what makes communication inspiring rather than merely informative consistently points to this quality of accurate emotional contact, the experience of having someone else see what actually matters to you and speak to it directly, rather than to a generic version of your demographic. This accuracy cannot be faked because generic emotional appeals are reliably detected and dismissed. The real thing is built through genuine curiosity about the specific person or audience being addressed. The ethics of persuasion is worth examining directly because the same psychological principles that enable a doctor to motivate a patient toward life-saving behavior changes can also be used by a manipulator to extract money from a vulnerable person. The principles do not have ethics built into them. The ethics must be supplied by the communicator's integrity. The framework this book operates within holds that persuasion is ethical when it uses accurate information, when the desired outcome is genuinely beneficial to the person being persuaded, and when the methods respect the person's agency rather than bypassing it. Within that framework, using the full understanding of human psychology to communicate more effectively is not manipulation. It is competence in service of genuine benefit. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Power of Deep Listening. The most common advice about becoming a better communicator focuses on speaking. Speak more clearly. Speak more confidently. Choose better words. Structure your arguments more effectively. Develop a more commanding vocal presence. All of this advice has real merit, but it misses what research on communication effectiveness consistently identifies as the skill most strongly correlated with being perceived as an excellent communicator. Not speaking, but listening. And not just being quiet while waiting to speak again, which is what most people do, but genuinely attending to the other person's experience with enough presence and accuracy that the person feels truly heard in a way that is rare and deeply powerful. The distinction between hearing and listening holds the key to understanding why so many conversations feel unsatisfying even when both parties appeared attentive. Hearing is physiological. It is what happens when sound waves reach the ear, and the auditory cortex converts them into recognizable information. It requires no deliberate effort and produces no relationship. Listening is psychological and relational. It is the deliberate direction of full attention toward understanding not just the literal content of what is being said, but the experience, intention, and meaning behind it. Genuine listening requires the active suppression of one of the most powerful cognitive tendencies humans have, which is the tendency to be continuously preparing a response rather than attending to what is actually being received. Research on the therapeutic relationship across different schools of psychotherapy consistently found that the quality of the relationship between therapist and client predicts therapeutic outcomes more reliably than the specific techniques being used. And the quality of that relationship is determined more than any other factor by how genuinely heard and understood the client feels. This finding, replicated extensively and taken seriously in therapeutic training programs, has implications that extend far beyond therapy. In any relationship where one person is trying to help, support, persuade, or lead another person, the quality of listening is a primary determinant of what becomes possible. The manager who listens with full presence to an employee's concern accomplishes more in that 10 minutes than the same manager who delivers a brilliant 10-minute speech to the same employee. Internal noise is the primary obstacle to genuine listening, and it exists in several forms that most people never explicitly identify. The most common is the response preparation noise, the continuous low-level activity of formulating what you will say next, which runs simultaneously with and competes with the processing of what is currently being said. A related form is evaluation noise, the ongoing internal assessment of whether what is being said agrees with what you already think, rather than simply receiving what is being said as new information. A third form is distraction noise, the attention pulled by external stimuli, or internal concerns, unrelated to the conversation. Each of these reduces the quality of listening in measurable ways, and each can be reduced through deliberate practice of the kind of disciplined attention that genuine listening requires. The specific behaviors that communicate listening to the speaker are worth studying separately from the internal experience of listening, because they are the visible expression of attentiveness that either confirms or contradicts the claim to be listening. Eye contact maintained with warmth, the body oriented toward the speaker, minimal disruption from devices or other environmental stimuli, brief verbal signals that track the narrative without redirecting it, the absence of the looking away that signals internal thought rather than external attention. All of these tell the speaker that what they are saying is being received seriously and with genuine presence. These behaviors are not performative if they emerge from actual internal attention, and they can serve as the scaffold for developing that attention in people who are more practiced at preparing to speak than at genuinely receiving. Questions asked in the service of genuine understanding, rather than in the service of redirecting the conversation toward what the listener finds more interesting, are among the most powerful listening tools available. The question that deepens the speaker's own thinking about what they have shared, that opens rather than closes the topic, that signals that the listener was tracking carefully enough to identify the most important, unexplored thread, is experienced by the speaker as extraordinarily validating. It proves through its specificity that they were actually heard. This kind of question requires real listening to generate, because it can only emerge from genuine attention to what was said rather than from a pre-prepared list of talking points. The quality of your questions reveals the quality of your listening more clearly than almost anything else. Silence, held appropriately after a significant disclosure or an important question, is the listening behavior that most people manage least skillfully, because the cultural discomfort with silence is strong and almost universally trained into people from childhood. But silence, in the right moment and held with genuine presence, rather than with anxiety, communicates something that no words can. It says this matters enough to sit with, rather than immediately move past. Research on pausing in counseling and coaching conversations found that allowing silence after significant disclosures reliably produced deeper self-disclosure, more genuine emotional honesty, and more creative thinking from the disclosing party than immediate verbal response from the listener. The silence is itself a communication, and what it communicates, when done well, is one of the most powerful things you can offer another person. The communicator who develops genuine listening skill becomes, over time, a qualitatively different kind of speaker as well. Not because listening and speaking are the same skill, but because genuine listening accumulates a depth of understanding of how other people think, what they care about, what they are actually saying beneath what they literally say, that cannot be developed any other way. The person who has listened deeply and widely to many people across many situations develops an accuracy about human experience that makes their communication more precisely targeted, more emotionally resonant, and more genuinely useful than the communication of an equally intelligent person who has never learned to genuinely hear. Listening is not the opposite of powerful communication. At its deepest level, it is the source of it. Chapter 6. Words that open minds and words that shut them. Language is not a neutral carrier of meaning. It is a shaper of thought. The specific words a communicator chooses do not simply describe a reality that exists independently of how it is described. They activate particular mental representations, emotional associations, and evaluative frameworks that determine how the described reality is experienced by the person receiving the description. The same policy can be framed as tax relief or as a budget cut and produce genuinely different emotional responses in people evaluating it. The same surgery can be described as having a 90% survival rate or a 10% mortality rate and produce measurably different anxiety in patients considering it. The same feedback can be framed as here is what needs to change, or here is what could make this excellent, and land in completely different psychological territory. Words are not labels. They are lenses. His concrete language outperforms abstract language in almost every communication objective. Yet most people default to abstraction because it feels safer and more flexible. The abstract claim, "we are committed to quality," says nothing a listener can hold on to and means nothing they can verify. The concrete claim, "our last 4 projects shipped on time and under budget," says something specific, checkable, and memorable. Research on processing fluency, the ease with which the brain processes incoming information, consistently shows that concrete, specific language is processed more easily, produces stronger memory encoding, and generates greater perceived credibility than abstract language conveying the same nominal content. The communicator who forces themselves to be specific, to replace general claims with actual examples, to replace abstractions with observable realities, is working with the brain rather than asking it to do extra translation work. Questions restructure conversations in ways that statements cannot. A well-placed question transfers the generation of the key insight to the listener, who then owns the conclusion in a way they would never own a conclusion handed to them by the speaker. Research on question-based persuasion found that people who arrived at a position through prompted self-reflection were more committed to that position and more resistant to subsequent challenges to it than people who were given the same position through argument. The question also signals something about the questioner: genuine curiosity rather than a desire to perform knowledge, interest in the other person's thinking rather than simply a platform for one's own. This signal is itself trust-building. The communicator who asks the right question often moves a conversation further than any statement could have. The language of possibility versus the language of constraint is one of the most practically significant word-level distinctions in communication. Conversations organized around what could be, what might be possible, what has worked in other situations, activate the brain's approach system, the motivational architecture associated with reward-seeking and creative expansion. Conversations organized around what cannot be done, what the limits are, what has failed before, activate the avoidance system, the motivational architecture associated with threat management and constraint. The same information about a situation can be organized in either direction. The communicator who sequences the possibility language first, before introducing genuine constraints, creates conditions in which the constraints are more likely to be treated as problems to solve than as reasons to stop trying. Inclusive pronouns are a small linguistic choice with measurable social effects. Shifting from I and you to we in collaborative contexts is not merely semantic. Research on pronoun use in organizational communication found that leaders and collaborators who habitually used first-person plural language were rated as more collaborative, generated more genuine contribution from people around them, and created stronger senses of shared ownership in the outcomes of group work than those who communicated primarily in the first person. The we is not just a courtesy. It activates a shared endeavor frame that changes the listener's psychological relationship to the work from observer to participant. That shift from observer to participant changes what people contribute, how much effort they invest, and how personally they take the outcome. Hedging language is a communication habit that reduces perceived competence and credibility more than almost any other single verbal behavior. Yet it is extremely common in people who are intellectually cautious. The word basically The construction, I am not sure, but maybe. The question inflection placed at the end of a declarative statement, all of these signal uncertainty in a way that causes listeners to discount the content of what follows. There is a meaningful difference between genuine, appropriate uncertainty, which should be communicated as such, and habitual hedging that reflects social anxiety rather than actual epistemic uncertainty. The person who says, "I believe this approach will work," is communicating conviction. The person who says, "I kind of think this might potentially be worth considering," is communicating that they do not fully stand behind their own content. Emotional language, when authentic, deepens the impact of communication in ways that purely informational language cannot reach. The disclosure of genuine feeling at the appropriate moment, in the appropriate proportion, signals that the communicator is a real person rather than a message delivery mechanism. And this humanizing effect produces connection that changes how everything else is received. Research on organizational communication and leadership found that leaders who expressed authentic emotion, genuine passion for the work, genuine concern for the people they led, genuine excitement about a direction, generated significantly higher levels of trust and inspiration than leaders who maintained a consistently neutral emotional presentation. The emotion must be genuine rather than performed for it to work. The performed version is detected and produces the opposite of the intended effect, reducing trust rather than building it. The pace at which language is delivered is a dimension most communicators have never deliberately examined, but that carries substantial psychological weight for the listener. Rapid speech suggests urgency or anxiety and can create mirroring anxiety in the listener that reduces their openness and their comprehension. Deliberate, unhurried speech suggests confidence and signals to the listener that the speaker is comfortable taking up the space and time the conversation requires. Strategic pauses, those placed before an important point rather than after it, signal that something significant is coming and invite the listener to increase their attention before the key content arrives. The communicator who has developed conscious control of pacing and strategic pausing has a tool that shapes the emotional experience of the conversation independently of the words being chosen. Chapter 7. Emotion as Information. Reading and responding to what is felt. Emotions in a conversation are not interruptions to the communication. They are the communication. When someone becomes angry in a discussion, the anger is not a problem that needs to be managed so the real conversation can continue. The anger is information, something about what has been said, implied, or absent has violated something the angry person values or needs. When someone becomes sad during an exchange, the sadness is not a disruption to the logical flow. It is a signal that something of genuine importance to them has been touched. The communicator who treats emotions as obstacles to the real content of a conversation systematically misses the most important information the conversation is producing and responds in ways that are disconnected from what the other person is actually experiencing. Emotional intelligence in communication, as developed and studied by researchers from Salovey and Mayer through Goleman and beyond, consists of 4 distinct but related capacities. The ability to perceive emotions accurately in oneself and others. The ability to use emotional information as an input to thinking, rather than as a noise to be filtered out. the understanding of how emotions work and how they evolve through sequences, and the ability to regulate one's own emotional states and facilitate regulation in others. Each of these capacities is developed through practice rather than innate, and each makes a distinct contribution to communication effectiveness. The communicator who has developed all four operates in a richer informational environment than the communicator who has learned to suppress their awareness of the emotional dimension of interaction. Perceiving emotions accurately is the foundational capacity because it is the prerequisite for everything else. A communicator who is not accurately reading what the other person is feeling is responding to a fiction they have constructed rather than to the actual person in front of them. Research on empathic accuracy, the ability to correctly infer what another person is feeling, found significant variation across individuals and found that this variation was strongly predicted by how much genuine attention the perceiver was paying to the other person's nonverbal cues. The person who is divided between attending to the other person and managing their own performance misses signals that the person whose full attention is directed outward catches. The attentional investment in the other person is not just courtesy. It is the data collection process that makes accurate emotional perception possible. The phenomenon of emotional contagion, mentioned in the first chapter, operates throughout conversations in ways that most people do not track consciously. Emotions are transmitted between people through facial expression, vocal tone, posture, and movement with a speed and efficiency that means the emotional climate of a conversation is continuously being negotiated between the parties, not just established at the outset. The communicator who becomes aware of emotional contagion as an ongoing process gains the ability to notice when they have absorbed an emotional state from the other person, and to distinguish that absorbed state from their own genuinely generated response. This distinction is not trivial. Acting on an absorbed emotion as though it were a self-generated one produces responses that are calibrated to the wrong source. Responding to the emotion rather than around it is the specific skill that most people lack, and that produces the most palpable difference in how conversations feel when it is present. The colleague who says, "I can see this," has been really frustrating before addressing the substance of a complaint, has done something qualitatively different from the colleague who immediately begins solving the problem. The first response acknowledges the emotional reality of the person in front of them. The second treats the emotion as irrelevant and goes directly to content. Research on patient satisfaction in medical contexts found that doctors who paused to acknowledge the emotional state visible in a patient before moving to clinical content were rated dramatically higher on communication quality and patient satisfaction, even when their clinical advice was identical to that of doctors who skipped the acknowledgement. The difference between empathy and sympathy is a distinction worth understanding carefully, because the two are frequently confused in ways that lead to responses that do not serve the person needing support. Sympathy is looking at another person's difficulty from the outside and expressing sorrow or concern about it. It maintains a distance between the experiencer and the observer. Empathy is the attempt to enter the other person's experience, to understand what it genuinely feels like from inside their particular history, needs, and current situation without losing one's own perspective. Research by Brené Brown on empathy and connection found that empathy builds connection, and that sympathy, particularly sympathy that introduces silver linings or comparisons, often produces disconnection because it maintains the distance rather than closing it. Managing your own emotional state in the middle of a charged conversation is the regulation dimension of emotional intelligence that conversation partners feel most acutely, even when they cannot name what they are feeling. The communicator who becomes flooded with their own emotional response, whether it is defensiveness, anxiety, anger, or hurt, is no longer receiving the other person accurately. They are processing their own state. Everything the other person says is being filtered through the activated emotional system, which colors the interpretation in ways that almost always move it away from accuracy and toward self-protective distortion. Developing the ability to notice when you are becoming flooded and to have a strategy for self-regulation that does not require exiting the conversation is one of the most important skills in all of communication development. Building a practice of emotional reading across ordinary daily interactions, not just high-stakes ones, develops the perceptual capacity that is needed when the stakes are high. The person who pays attention to what is felt in ordinary conversations, who notices the subtle shift in another person's energy when a topic is touched, who tracks the emotional arc of a discussion rather than only its content arc, is continuously developing a pattern library that real-time emotional perception draws from. This library cannot be built through study alone. It is built through the accumulation of attentive experience, of having attended to the emotional reality of many conversations and having gradually developed the sensitivity to read what is there with increasing accuracy. Chapter 8. Difficult Conversations. The psychology of getting through them. Difficult conversations are the ones that matter most and that most people prepare for least. The performance review that has a genuine problem at its center. The relationship conversation that cannot be deferred any longer without cost. The feedback that is needed and that the person giving it knows will not be easy to receive. The disagreement that cannot be resolved by pretending it does not exist. Most people approach these conversations with one of two equally ineffective strategies. They avoid them until the situation has become much worse than it needed to be, or they engage in them with such anxiety and defensiveness that the conversation produces outcomes neither party intended. Understanding the psychology of difficult conversations offers a third option: going in prepared, realistic, and skilled enough to navigate what arises rather than simply surviving what happens. Research by Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen, synthesized in their landmark book on difficult conversations, identified 3 simultaneous conversations that occur in every difficult exchange. The first is the what happened conversation, focused on the substance of the disagreement and each party's account of the facts and their interpretation. The second is the feelings conversation, in which each party is managing their own emotional response to the situation and the interaction. The third is the identity conversation, the internal process by which each party is managing the implications of the conversation for how they see themselves. Most failed difficult conversations fail because the participants are engaged in the identity and feelings conversations while only addressing the what happened conversation. The content is discussed, but the identity fears and emotional realities that our driving behavior are never acknowledged, so the content discussion makes no real progress. The most reliable predictor of whether a difficult conversation will end with the relationship stronger or weaker is not the content of what is said, but the quality of the listening offered by both parties. Research on conflict resolution found that mutual understanding, the shared sense that both parties genuinely understand the other's perspective, was more predictive of positive outcomes than agreement on the facts of the dispute or resolution of the specific issue. Two people who fully understand each other's perspective can often find resolution even when they disagree about what happened or what should be done. Two people who share a factual understanding of the situation but feel mutually unheard cannot resolve even simple conflicts without accumulating resentment that damages future interactions. Preparation for a difficult conversation requires thinking not about what you want to say, but about what the other person is likely experiencing and needing. Most people prepare for difficult conversations by rehearsing their own argument, anticipating objections, and planning their responses. This preparation makes the speaker more confident in their own position, but does not prepare them for the relational and emotional complexity they will actually encounter. More useful preparation involves genuinely considering the other person's perspective. What is their experience of the situation? What needs or concerns are likely to be driving their behavior? What would they need to feel in order to be genuinely open to hearing a difficult message? And what is the most genuine possible account of the situation that acknowledges the legitimate aspects of their view, even while holding your own? The opening moments of a difficult conversation set a tone that is very hard to shift once established. Research on conversational frames in conflict situations found that conversations that began with genuine acknowledgement of the difficulty or complexity of the situation rather than with an opening position or an accusation produced significantly more positive outcomes than those that began with the substantive content before any relational attunement had been established. The opening that says, "I want to talk about something that I think is important for both of us, and I am a bit nervous about how to say this well," does three things. It establishes shared purpose. It signals that the speaker is approaching with care rather than certainty. And it models the kind of honest vulnerability that makes genuine dialogue possible. The physiological flooding that occurs during intense conflict is one of the most important phenomena to understand in difficult conversations because it explains the pattern of escalation that neither party intended, but that both contributed to. When the stress response is fully activated during conflict, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain capable of genuine listening, perspective-taking, and creative problem-solving, is significantly compromised. The conversation is being conducted by two nervous systems in threat mode rather than two minds genuinely trying to understand and resolve something. Research by Gottman on flooding in relationship conflicts found that taking a genuine break of at least 20 minutes, not as a form of stonewalling, but as an agreed-upon physiological reset, consistently produced more productive subsequent conversations than continuing while flooded. Validation is the most underused and most immediately effective tool in difficult conversations. Validation does not mean agreement. It means the acknowledgement that the other person's perspective makes sense from inside their experience, even when you see things differently. Research on social influence and conflict resolution found consistently that people become more flexible in their positions when they feel that their perspective has been genuinely understood, not evaluated and found lacking, but actually received as a reasonable response to their experience. The communicator who can say, "I can understand why this has felt unfair from where you are standing, and here is how I have been experiencing it differently," has done something that creates more movement than any amount of argument for their own position. Apology, when it is genuine and well-timed, is among the most powerful restorative tools in difficult conversations, and its rarity and difficulty is exactly proportional to its power. Research on the components of effective apology found that the elements that matter most to the recipient are the specific acknowledgement of what was done and its impact, the expression of genuine remorse that is not qualified by an implicit but, and the credible indication of different behavior going forward. The apology that contains these elements and is delivered without conditions produces substantially more repair than the sophisticated non-apology that acknowledges the other person's feelings without acknowledging any actual responsibility. The capacity for genuine apology requires the ego strength to take full responsibility rather than distributing it, which is among the more demanding things communication asks of us. Chapter 9. Presence, the quality that changes every room. There is a quality possessed by the most powerful communicators that is not in their vocabulary, their voice, or their argument structure. It is in their attention. When they are with you, they are actually with you, not partly with you, while managing their performance, not attending to you, while simultaneously monitoring how they are coming across. They are genuinely present, fully directed toward the other person, responding to what is actually happening in the moment rather than to a rehearsed plan for what they had expected to be happening. This quality, which, for lack of a better word, is called presence, is felt by every person in contact with it before they have identified what they are feeling. People describe it as being seen, as being taken seriously, as feeling like what they say genuinely matters. These descriptions are pointing at the same thing: the rare experience of another person's full attention. The neuroscience of presence reveals why it is so powerfully felt, even when it cannot be articulated. Mirror neurons, the neural systems discovered in the 1990s in macaque monkeys and subsequently studied in humans, fire both when a person performs an action and when they observe the same action performed by another. This system underlies much of the human capacity for imitation, learning, and social connection. When another person is fully present with you, when their attention is genuinely directed toward your experience, their mirror systems are actively engaged with your behavior and expression in a way that produces genuine neural synchronization between you. The experience of being felt rather than just heard is this synchronization being registered at a level below conscious awareness. It is why being in the presence of a genuinely present listener feels qualitatively different from being heard by someone who is multitasking. The obstacles to presence are predominantly internal, rather than external, in most modern communication contexts. The most significant is the continuous generation of self-referential thought that runs parallel to any experience of being with another person. How am I coming across? What should I say next? Is this going well? What does this person think of me? This self-monitoring is not entirely unproductive. Some level of self-awareness is useful in communication. But when self-monitoring becomes the primary activity, rather than a background process, it consumes the attentional resources that genuine presence requires. The communicator who is continuously monitoring their own performance is not listening. They are managing their image while performing the appearance of listening. And the person they are with can feel the difference. Mindfulness, understood not as a spiritual practice, but as the cognitive skill of directing attention to the present moment, rather than to the past or the projected future, is the training most directly relevant to developing communicative presence. Research on mindfulness-based interventions and their effects on social cognition found that even brief periods of mindfulness practice improved people's ability to attend to others, reduce the interference of self-referential thought during social interaction, and increase the accuracy of emotional perception. The communicator who has developed any capacity for deliberately directing attention to what is actually present, rather than to what was or what might be, has access to a quality of presence in conversation that is genuinely unusual. The paradox of communicative presence is that it ultimately produces better communication outcomes for the speaker, while requiring the speaker to be less focused on communication outcomes. The person who enters a conversation focused on what they want to achieve from it is continuously processing information through the filter of whether it advances their agenda, which reduces both the accuracy of their perception and the experience of being genuinely heard that the other person needs in order to be genuinely open. The person who enters a conversation focused on genuinely understanding the other person without attachment to where that understanding will lead creates conditions of openness and trust that make whatever they subsequently need to communicate more likely to be received. The counterintuitive truth is that letting go of the outcome is often the fastest route to achieving it. Physical stillness contributes to communicative presence in ways that most people have not explicitly considered. The communicator who moves frequently, who shifts weight, adjusts their appearance, handles objects, or checks their phone during a conversation, is continuously communicating the presence of competing attentional demands. Physical stillness, by contrast, signals that all attention is available for this moment and this person. Research on physical behavior and perceived engagement found that stillness was one of the strongest nonverbal signals of genuine interest and attention, particularly when combined with genuine eye contact and a physically open orientation. The capacity for physical stillness in conversation requires first becoming aware of the habitual movements that signal distraction, and then developing the ability to reduce them through the practice of grounded, settled physical presence. Phone and device management during conversations is the contemporary presence challenge that is simultaneously the most significant and the most culturally normalized. Research on the mere presence of smartphones, even face down and silent, found measurable reductions in conversation quality and in each participant's sense of being connected to the other. The cognitive and relational cost of the phone on the table is real and documented, even when the phone is not checked during the conversation. The communicator who removes the device from the conversational space entirely, rather than simply silencing it, is making a choice that communicates something about what they value, that the person across from them registers, whether or not it is explicitly noted. Developing presence as a communication practice requires treating the cultivation of genuine attention as seriously as the development of any other communication skill. This means building the capacity to be fully in one conversation rather than partially in many. It means practicing the physical habits that support rather than undermine attentional availability. It means developing enough mindfulness to notice when attention has wandered internally and to return it to the person in front of you. And it means making a value commitment that the person you are with is worth your full attention for the duration of your time together. The communicators who are most remembered, most trusted, and most influential are almost always the ones who made other people feel that, for the time they were together, nothing else in the world mattered more. Chapter 10. Commanding a Room, the Psychology of Collective Attention. Walking into a group setting to speak involves a specific psychological challenge that one-on-one conversation does not present. The need to capture and hold collective attention across a group of people who are each bringing their own concerns, distractions, and internal conversations to the same space. The speaker in a group context is competing not just with external distractions, but with the inner lives of every person in the audience, with the meeting they just came from, the email they are worried about, the conversation they are half composing in their heads. The speaker who knows this and designs their communication to win that competition is approaching group communication with the realism it requires. The speaker who assumes the audience is simply waiting to receive does not understand the environment they are actually operating in. The opening of any group communication is its most critical moment, not because audiences are unable to recover from a slow start, but because the primacy effect ensures that the opening moment sets a reception frame that shapes how everything following it is processed. Research on attention in group communication settings found that audience engagement peaks in the first 30 to 60 seconds of a presentation, drops to its lowest point in the middle, and recovers briefly near the end. The communicator who understands this pattern designs their most important content into the opening and closing windows, rather than building linearly toward a revelation that arrives after the audience's engagement has already peaked and troughed. Beginning with a genuinely surprising fact, a question that activates real curiosity, a story that creates immediate emotional investment, or a counterintuitive claim that violates expectation, exploits the peak attention of the opening window. The relationship between speaker energy and audience energy is one of the most operationally important dynamics in group communication, and one that many speakers ignore because they are so focused on managing their own experience of the presentation. Audiences entrain to speakers. Emotional contagion, operating at the group level, means that the energy, enthusiasm, confidence, or anxiety that the speaker brings to the room spreads through the audience in ways that are measurable and significant. The speaker who approaches the front of a room with genuine enthusiasm for what they are about to share creates a different emotional climate than the speaker who approaches with the apologetic energy of someone who is not sure this will be worth the audience's time. The audience does not decide to respond to these signals. They respond automatically. Eye contact in group settings operates through a mechanism that is different from eye contact in one-on-one conversation, but equally important. Research on group communication and speaker credibility found that speakers who made distributed, genuine eye contact across their audience, staying with each individual for long enough to create a sense of actual connection before moving to the next person, were rated higher on credibility, persuasiveness, and engagement than speakers who either avoided eye contact, scanned the room without connecting, or focused exclusively on a few friendly faces. The experience of receiving genuine eye contact from a speaker in a group setting produces the same sense of being actually seen that one-on-one eye contact produces. And that sense, extended across a room, creates a collective experience of being connected to the speaker rather than simply observed by them. Movement in a space is a speaker's tool for controlling the focus and energy of a group that most amateur speakers never learn to use deliberately. Research on speaker movement and audience attention found that purposeful movement toward the audience, used at moments of particular emphasis or to create physical proximity with different parts of the room, consistently increased engagement and attention. Movement away from the audience, or movement that is continuous and without apparent purpose, consistently reduced it. The deliberate use of stillness at key moments, standing completely still in a position that is physically open and settled, produces a gravitational quality that pulls audience attention in the same way that any change in a visual field pulls the eye. The speaker who can move with purpose and stand with genuine stillness is using their body as a presentation tool. Stories in group presentations work through a mechanism that data and argument do not access. They activate the story processing networks of the audience's brains, which are wired to track narrative arcs with the same investment the brain brings to tracking real events in the real world. Research on neural coupling in storytelling found that when a speaker tells a genuine story with emotional authenticity, the brain activity of the listeners begins to mirror the brain activity of the speaker across the regions associated with meaning-making, emotional processing, and social understanding. This neural synchrony is the physical substrate of the feeling of being moved by a story. It is also why well-told stories, in the service of a message, make that message so much more durable than the same message delivered as abstract argument. Handling questions and unexpected moments in group settings is where the gap between the rehearsed communicator and the genuinely skilled one becomes most visible. The rehearsed communicator, surprised by a question they did not anticipate or a situation they did not plan for, is suddenly operating without their script in a context where the audience is watching closely. The genuinely skilled communicator has developed the capacity to work in real time with whatever arrives, to treat unexpected moments as opportunities rather than threats, and to respond from genuine engagement with what is actually happening rather than from a map of what was supposed to happen. This capacity is built through the deliberate practice of communicating in conditions of genuine uncertainty rather than always seeking to minimize surprise. The speaker who holds a room over a sustained period has solved a specific attention management problem that goes beyond the opening. Human attention, when sustained, moves in waves. It rises during novelty or emotional engagement, drops during repetition or abstraction, and can be reset by a change in format, by a surprising disclosure, by a well-placed question directed at the audience, or by a physical shift in the speaker's position or energy. The communicator who understands attention curves designs variation into their communication rather than maintaining a single register throughout. They read the room's energy level in real time and respond to drops in engagement with deliberate resets, rather than simply pressing on through diminishing attention with the hope that the content alone will pull the audience back. Chapter 11. Digital Communication, the Psychology of the Screen. The majority of professional and personal communication now happens through screens. Emails, texts, video calls, messaging platforms, social media, and collaborative digital tools have become the primary medium through which many people conduct most of their significant relationships and most of their consequential professional interactions. And yet, most of the psychological principles that govern communication were developed and validated in face-to-face contexts, where the full bandwidth of human social signaling was available. The migration of communication to digital mediums has not eliminated these psychological principles. It has changed which aspects of them are available and has introduced new dynamics that face-to-face communication did not have. Understanding the psychology of digital communication is not optional for anyone who conducts significant relationships or professional work through screens. The single most consequential feature of text-based digital communication is the elimination of the nonverbal channel. In face-to-face communication, tone, pace, facial expression, posture, and gesture together carry the majority of emotional and relational information. In a text message or email, none of these channels exist. What remains is the literal content of the words and whatever emotional interpretation the reader constructs to fill the enormous gap left by the absent nonverbal information. Research on email interpretation consistently finds that readers attribute more negativity to neutral messages than writers intended, a phenomenon called the negativity bias in digital interpretation. The person who receives an email with no greeting and no warmth signaling language does not interpret it as neutral. They interpret it as cold or hostile. The writer who believed they were being efficiently brief was communicating something they did not intend. Response time in asynchronous digital communication has become a social signaling mechanism that carries emotional and relational information whether the communicator intends it to or not. Research on email response time and relationship quality found that the time elapsed before a response is sent is interpreted by the recipient as a signal of how important the sender considers the interaction or the relationship. Slow responses to important messages are experienced as low prioritization, even when the actual reason for the delay was unrelated to the sender's assessment of the importance of the message. The communicator who understands this manages response time deliberately, at least in significant relationships, acknowledging receipt of important messages even when a full response is not yet available. Video calls have introduced a communication format that is neither face-to-face conversation nor traditional phone interaction, but a hybrid with its own specific psychological dynamics. Research on video conference fatigue found that the sustained effort of maintaining appropriate facial expression awareness in the camera's field, without the natural breaks and position changes of face-to-face interaction, combined with the cognitive demand of processing reduced bandwidth nonverbal information produces a form of cognitive and emotional fatigue not experienced in equivalent face-to-face meetings. The communicator who understands this designs video interactions with appropriate recovery time, avoids the temptation to convert every meeting to a video format, regardless of whether it requires the visual channel, and attends to the specific features of the video medium that either support or undermine the quality of connection it can facilitate. The eye contact problem on video calls illustrates how the medium changes the physics of social signaling in ways that require deliberate adaptation. In a face-to-face conversation, looking at the other person's eyes creates genuine mutual gaze. On a video call, looking at the other person's image on the screen creates the appearance of looking down or sideways from their perspective, while looking at the camera lens creates the appearance of eye contact from their perspective but makes it impossible for you to see their expression. This is a structural problem with the medium, rather than a personal failing. But it means that the communicator who wants to create the sense of genuine eye contact on video calls must develop the counterintuitive habit of looking at the camera lens rather than at the other person's image, at least during moments when the experience of direct connection matters most. Written communication, whether in email, messaging, or any other text format, rewards deliberate attention to opening and closing lines in ways that parallel the primacy and recency effects in spoken communication. Research on email communication and recipient impression formation found that the opening line of a professional email determines the recipient's initial impression of the sender's warmth, competence, and professionalism within the first 5 words. The generic opening of, "I hope this email finds you well," registers as a filler that the reader scans past. The opening that makes specific reference to something real in the relationship or context immediately signals attention and genuine engagement that changes the reception frame for everything that follows. Similarly, the closing line of any important written communication carries the recency effect. It is what the reader will carry away. And designing it to leave the impression and the call to action you actually intend is time consistently well spent. Social media as a communication context has introduced dynamics around audience awareness, performance, and authenticity that are genuinely novel in the history of human communication. The ability to see exactly how many people viewed a message, how many responded positively, and how the response compares to previous messages creates a feedback environment that is unprecedented and that has measurable psychological effects on the content people choose to share and the identities they construct in the process. Research on social media communication and authenticity found that people whose online communication was rated as more authentic, meaning more consistent with how people who knew them well described their actual personality, reported higher well-being and stronger relationships than those whose online communication was more performative. The psychological cost of maintaining a curated online persona that diverges significantly from the actual self accumulates in ways that eventually affect both well-being and the quality of the relationships that form around the performance. The most important principle for digital communication psychology is one that applies across all digital mediums. the medium reduces bandwidth, and that reduction is consistently filled by the receiver's assumptions rather than by the sender's intentions. Every time you remove a communication channel, whether the removal is visual, tonal, or temporal, you leave a gap that the receiving mind fills with whatever its current state, biases, and relationship history make most available. The skilled digital communicator actively compensates for these reductions by being more explicit about emotional tone than feels necessary in person, by over-communicating warmth and positive intent in contexts where it would be naturally visible through nonverbal channels, and by being thoughtfully deliberate about the format they choose for any given communication rather than defaulting to whatever is most convenient for the sender. Chapter 12. Becoming the communicator your life requires. There is a version of every important relationship in your life that was made possible or foreclosed by the quality of communication within it. There is a career trajectory that took the shape it did partly because of how you communicated in specific, pivotal conversations. There are people who trust you deeply, and that depth of trust was built or damaged, conversation by conversation across time. There are people who have never fully known you, not because they were uninterested, but because the communication that would have let them in was never quite attempted. The quality of your communication is not a peripheral skill that operates on the side of a full life. It is the medium through which the full life is built, one conversation at a time. The journey from wherever you currently are as a communicator to wherever this book is pointing is not a linear path. No communication development is. You will apply a principle, and it will work beautifully, and then you will forget it entirely in a high-stakes moment where it was most needed. You will develop a new level of listening skill and discover that a familiar pattern of internal noise has been quietly undermining it for weeks without your noticing. You will build real trust with someone through a period of genuine, honest engagement, and then erode some of it through a single moment of managed, rather than real communication. This is not failure. It is the actual texture of developmental work on something as complex as how you show up in relationship with other human beings. The specific areas where each communicator has the most room to grow are different, and honest self-assessment is the only way to identify them accurately rather than working on the areas that are most comfortable or most visible. The person who is genuinely skilled at establishing trust in initial conversations, but who consistently struggles when conversations require them to hold a position under pushback, has a different development priority than the person who is clear and direct in disagreement, but who has never developed the warmth and attunement that make directness feel like caring rather than aggression. The person who speaks powerfully in groups but cannot sustain the quality of attention that genuine one-on-one connection requires has different work to do than the person who is deeply present in intimate conversations, but is undone by the performance demands of larger audiences. Feedback is the developmental resource that most people resist precisely when they need it most. The instinct to protect the self-image from information that challenges it is strong and understandable. But no amount of self-reflection produces the quality of developmental information that direct, honest feedback from someone who has experienced your communication does. The gap between how you believe you are coming across and how you are actually experienced by others is almost always larger than your current level of self-awareness can reveal. Closing that gap requires the specific vulnerability of asking people whose honest input you trust to tell you what your communication actually produces in them. What is helpful? What is landing differently than you intend? And where the gap between your intention and your impact is most consistently appearing. Practice, in the context of communication development, means something different from practice in the context of technical skill acquisition. You cannot practice a conversation in isolation, the way a musician can practice scales. Communication exists only in relation to other people. What you can practice is the specific skills that conversations draw on, the quality of listening you bring to any interaction, the deliberateness of your language choices, the awareness of nonverbal signals you are generating and receiving, the ability to hold your own emotional state while attending accurately to another person's. Each conversation is a practice opportunity for these skills, which means that every ordinary exchange across every ordinary day is a development environment if you are choosing to treat it that way. The communities you are part of shape your communication more than any individual commitment you make to developing it, because communities establish the ambient standards against which you unconsciously calibrate your own performance. Being regularly in the presence of people who communicate with genuine skill, who listen with real presence, who bring honesty and care to difficult conversations, raises the felt standard for what good communication looks like in a way that individual effort cannot replicate. Conversely, being surrounded primarily by communication that is managed, performative, and emotionally defensive gradually normalizes those qualities in ways that work against deliberate development. The most important choice a developing communicator can make about their environment is to find and join communities of people whose communication quality is above their own current level. The relationship between your communication and your character is ultimately the deepest truth this book has been building toward. Communication is not a set of techniques layered on top of a self that remains unchanged by them. It is the expression of what you actually believe, how you actually see other people, what you actually value in your relationships and your work, and how you actually hold yourself in the uncertainty of genuine exchange with another human being. Techniques improve expression. Character determines what is being expressed. The communicator who develops only technique has a more polished surface. The communicator who develops character and technique together has something genuinely worth communicating. Begin the next conversation differently than you began the last one. Not dramatically, not with a full commitment to every principle in this book, simultaneously applied, just with one shift. Listen a little more carefully. Be a little more honest than is comfortable. Bring a little more genuine presence than you have been bringing. Ask one question that comes from real curiosity rather than from the desire to appear engaged. Acknowledge one thing that is emotionally real before moving to the content that was prepared. These small shifts, made consistently across the hundreds of conversations that constitute an ordinary week, accumulate into something that looks, from the outside, like someone who knows how to communicate. But from the inside, it feels like something more important than skill. It feels like being more fully present with the people and the moments that make a life worth having.